Good evening, everyone. We're so glad that you're here joining us on this wet and unfortunately rainy evening, but we're so honored that you've taken the time and energy to join us. I'm Rabbi Jesse Gallup, the senior rabbi here at Temple Israel of New Rochelle, and it is my great pleasure to host Dr. Kurtzer for an important conversation about Israel. Tonight's talk will focus on the Israeli psyche, dynamics in American Jewish community, anti-Semitism, and Israel diaspora relations. Questions regarding geopolitics of the region will not be discussed this evening. Looking around the sanctuary, I can see that we come from a variety of backgrounds, and our viewpoints may vary greatly. Tonight is about respect, civility, and intellectual honesty. There will be some time for questions at the end of the evening after our conversation is done. I would like to take a moment to thank our ASL interpreters, Nina Sturmer and Tracy Romanow, as well as our co-sponsors of this event, congregations and organizations, Beth El Synagogue Center, Congregation Kol Ami, Congregation KTI, Largemont Temple, Scarsdale Synagogue, Temples Tremont and Emmanuel, Sharei Tikva, Westchester Jewish Center, Westchester Reformed Temple, as well as the Westchester Jewish Council. Thank you all for your support. Tonight's program is a part of an ongoing series from Temple Israel's Israel Action Committee, whose goal is to bring forth in-depth learning and conversations helping congregants to better understand Israel and deepen their connections to the Jewish homeland. I would like to introduce my conversation partner and our special guest for the evening. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer is president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. Yehuda is a leading thinker and author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews, on Jewish history and Jewish memory, and on questions of leadership and change in American Jewish life. He led the creation of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America in 2010 as a pioneering research and educational center for the leadership of the North American Jewish community. He is the author of Shuvah, The Future of the Jewish Past, which offers new thinking to contemporary Jews on navigating the tensions between history and memory, and the co-editor of the New Jewish Canon, a collection of the most significant Jewish ideas and debates of the past two generations. He is also the host of Hartman's Identity Crisis podcast, which can be found at identitycrisispod.com. We welcome you and are so glad to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much.
So, to give a little background, I reached out to the Shalom Hartman Institute right after October 7th. In this congregation, we first did a factual 101 of what was going on, because there was a lot of talking heads spinning this way or that way. And really, as a congregation, we try to have a factual conversation, knowing that people came from different backgrounds. And at the same time, we knew that Israel was forever changed. That after what happened on October the 7th, it wasn't going to go back to the normal. It wasn't going to go back to a life that we all had known. And in this community, we wanted to reach someone who had more in-depth knowledge than we had within our synagogue institution. And we wanted somebody who was humble and open-minded that can begin to answer questions, and in many ways, these questions can never be fully answered. So it was really generous of the Hartman Institute and Yehuda to take us up on this offer to have a conversation. And so tonight I have a few questions. There are some questions that I wanted to ask that weren't really in the purview of this conversation. We would love to know what's going to happen with the Israeli politics or with the new government in Gaza after the war is over. But nobody really knows those answers. It's like when politicians or political spin people give you answers and then 4 months later, they're obsolete. So I hope this is nourishing your soul with Torah and looking at what it means for us, not just for Israel. So the first question I would like to ask you is, how has Israeli society changed since October 7th's terrorist attack and the war with Hamas? And do you think that these shifts are permanent?
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for having me here, and I'm grateful for all of the partner synagogues and institutions in Westchester for creating an event like this. One of the things that we talk about a lot at the Shalom Hartman Institute is that in many cases, the educational programs we try to create, the activity is the outcome. So when we can get a lot of synagogues to collaborate and cooperate and to center serious discussion of ideas and learning about our most pressing questions, it's not just the activity that we're doing, but it's actually a means of visualizing the Jewish community that we wish that we had. So I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you, Rabbi Gal, for having us, and thank you to the Hartman team as well. I want to answer this a little bit personally, if possible. I've been in Israel 3 times since October 7th. The most recent trip, I came back on, what day is today? Tuesday? I came back on Sunday. Thank you. I don't know who answered that. Yeah, thank you. I came back a couple days ago. The first trip that I took to Israel was on October 14th. It wasn't because October 7th happened and I went out and bought a ticket. I happened to have a planned trip. It happened to have been the first time in years that I was flying El Al as opposed to United, and therefore the ticket still worked, and I just got on the plane and went. I went again in January, and I went again this past week to be with my colleagues. The 3 different trips wound up taking on their own thematic quality, and a little bit of the story of what's happening to Israeli society or to the psychology, the psyche of Israeliness. I felt like I've been witnessing in real time in these 3 different experiences. And in some ways, if you're familiar with the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, her story of the stages of grief, I feel like I had the opportunity to witness a whole society working through a profound trauma, and by kind of checking in and checking out every 6 weeks, watching a society work through the various stages, maybe not in the exact order of how that book is written, but signaling the significance, the magnitude of what took place on October 7th. So the first visit, that week of October 14th, was something I'd never seen or imagined, which was an entire country grappling with a shock and a trauma on multiple levels. You know, when you have 1,200 people killed, a few hundred abducted, 300 to 400,000 people called up into active duty overnight, hundreds of thousands of people displaced, the consequences of that, the magnitude of that, means that there's no household that is not affected by those events. There's literally no household not affected in one way or another by those events. And Israeli society was truly struggling with, grappling with the magnitude of what it had just experienced for a week. While I was there, it felt like the dynamics that you experience at a shiva, but imagine them in a country. Hushed voices, almost an altered state of consciousness, people not sure how to show up in public or even in private. Trauma and shock. The second trip that I took to Israel felt very different. The state of the initial shock had worn off. I wouldn't go so far as saying that the trauma of October 7th had gone away. It's still very much present in Israeli society. But what had reemerged in Israeli society over the first few months after the outbreak of the war was a kind of resignedness. Originally I was using the word hopelessness, and my Israeli friends pushed back respectfully. They said, no, we're never hopeless, but we are resigned to a reality and a story that we had thought wasn't the story anymore in Israel. The way of describing this is, for 16 years, and in part because of failed policy by the Netanyahu government and a variety of other reasons, Israelis had been lulled into a sense that the conflict with the Palestinians was largely under control, and that there was never any imminent existential threat at its borders. Israelis have been talking about existential threats from Iran for quite some time, but the idea that something like this could happen at the border of Israel simply had fallen off of the radar screen of many Israelis. And so kind of phase two was a resignedness back to a story of Israel that Israelis had set aside for quite some time. And that was paired with something that many of us recognize among Israelis, which is a profound sense of resilience. As many of you have seen and watched, Israelis have mobilized in extraordinarily powerful ways throughout the past number of months to build the home front, which we know is a companion piece of a country effectively fighting a war. And it's particularly been important in Israel because there's so much anger and distrust of government that many Israelis view the work of supporting the home front, whether it's taking care of internally displaced people, whether it's supporting folks whose families are at war, whether it's supporting a huge network of now widows and orphans in Israel, they view that work as replacing what government should be doing. So it's actually it's like a dual civic act, one that's not just rooted in loving kindness, but in kind of civic responsibility. So the second story was one of resignedness and resilience. And I want to share with you, it's hard to say, but my experience of the past week was that something had shifted. Those dynamics were still there, shock and trauma, resignedness and resilience, but moved on to fear and anger. And there was something very hard and harsh about the widespread nature of the fear and the anger. The fear is largely about the northern border, more than it is about Gaza. There's a perception within Israel that whether or not Israel actually wins the war with Hamas, however that's defined, that Israel will be able to control the south, but that there's something deeply unpredictable and much scarier if there's a conflagration at the northern border. Hezbollah is 4 times the size of Hamas. Their weaponry is far more sophisticated. They could really bring the country to a screeching halt. So there's a tremendous amount of fear, and the way that it shows up is people don't talk about it. So, as one friend described to me, he said, you can talk for 2 hours with someone about all the things that people are dealing with and struggling with, and then at the end, somebody will say, oh, and the North. And then everyone's like, yeah, the North, and then that conversation ends. So the fear is there, but I would say that the fear and the anger are also manifesting in a few other places. There is more internal Israeli anger at the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox population than I've seen in Israel in decades. For a long time, there's been frustration with the fact that the ultra-Orthodox communities don't serve in the army, but many Israelis kind of wrote it off as like, well, they're never going to change. And now there's a lot of frustration that the ultra-Orthodox community, their lives have been not disrupted at all. In fact, one of the weird subtexts of today there were municipal elections in Israel. And if you look at the voter turnout and the maps across the country, ultra-Orthodox turnout was the highest of any other population. And part of the reason for that is hundreds of thousands of Israelis can't show up to vote because they're at war. So Haredim are actually acquiring political power in a moment like this, and it's generating a lot of resentment. The hatred is directed in some cases at each other in parts of Israeli society, which was difficult to watch. I saw something incredible in the Shuk on Friday afternoon where somebody had a stand with an incredibly racist and inflammatory slogan. And someone else came over and they were screaming at each other, just face to face. And at one point, the woman who was screaming at this man was basically saying, I agree with you about the pain, but this is not the way. And when she started to confess all of the ways in which she and her family had also been affected by October 7th, I've never seen anything like this happen. They paused, hugged each other, separated, and went back to screaming again. So there's that, and most of all, the hatred in Israel right now is directed towards the government. This is a government that is widely seen, even by its supporters, as having failed the country on October 7th, failed to adhere to many now. We have good records of the intelligence reports that were available and warning signs and so forth. But also remember that until October 7th, the country was deeply divided about the judicial reform processes and the story of Israeli democracy. So you take all of that, wed it to this crisis, and there's just a tremendous amount of fear and anger. So, it's a long way of saying there is no one Israeli psyche. Of course, Israelis are a complex and diverse people, but they are also involved in this kind of powerful, evolving story that I've had a front row seat to witness that it's changing every 6 weeks. And I think it's fair for us to anticipate that the country is going to continue to go through those kinds of evolutions as it sorts out what I think all of us know to be the most seismic political event around Israel, at least for my generation in our lifetime, and for maybe people of an older generation since the Yom Kippur War.
So, listening to you talk, it makes me think about when I lived in Israel during the Second Intifada. And there's bus bombings and regular terrorist attacks, and life never felt stable. Mm-hmm. Sounds different. It sounds back then people were angry mostly at the terrorists. It sounds like right now the anger is internal as well as external. And so do you think it's a different kind of situation than like the Second Intifada, or it's just more intense right now because it's the new wave of terrorism facing the country?
Well, I'm not sure, because if you remember, prior to the Second Intifada, Israeli internal politics were as hostile as they had ever been, producing ultimately the Rabin assassination. So I don't think the internal dynamics around hostility around politics versus hostility towards the terrorists, those have always kind of gone together. Mm-hmm. In fact, they've sometimes been exploited, right? When Israelis feel vulnerable, or the terrorists can play this game around Israeli vulnerabilities in ways that are quite striking. The difference between then and now, for those who experienced those really traumatic years of the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, was that terror during that period of time was imminent. It was around every corner. It was any coffee shop. I remember living in Jerusalem in the mid-90s, and the same bus line, the 18 bus line, got bombed on consecutive weeks on the same day. So people who lived, and it was one of the most essential bus lines in Jerusalem, those who lived in those neighborhoods just felt like they were taking their lives in their hands just by going to the supermarket. It's not exactly the story now in Israel. What the country is reeling from a version of a terror attack that it's never had before, and it almost is confusing because it's a terror attack that is also a military incursion. Right? So even when we think about this like conceptually, is Israel fighting a war on terror, or is it fighting a war at its border against another country? It actually, it is a war on terror, but it more accurately resembles a foreign invasion. The army has gone in to fight against an army of 40,000 people. In fact, political scientists are struggling right now even with the terminology, because terror connotes isolated cells of marginal individuals with radical political views. Terror doesn't usually describe a pretty well-trained, well-funded army of 40,000 people that, by the way, also exercises political control over the area in which it's living and is responsible for sanitation and food and so forth. So there's something, the categories are not fully clean in terms of what Israelis are engaging with. And as a result, it's not quite, I didn't live through the major Israeli wars of 67 and 73, but I'd have to imagine that the way in which Israelis are responding to this is a lot more like a war against an invading army than it is trying to respond to a terror attack as though that's something domestic that's taken place within its borders. I want to give you one example that gives you a window into how complicated Israeli political identity is right now. There's the folks who literally were responsible for running the Jerusalem protests against the government because of the anti-democratic legislation that the government was trying to push forward around the Supreme Court. Those very same people overnight became the organizers of the Jerusalem municipality's it's called a Hamal, but it's like the social support system to take care of refugees, displaced people, and people whose families have been torn apart by the war. So it's fascinating because sometimes we tend to think that those who are political dissidents are always political dissidents, and these folks were basically reminding us that being a political dissident is the same thing as being a patriot. And they immediately turned the same WhatsApp groups that were getting people out to the protests in Jerusalem to being the means to help support the system. And my friend who runs it also had 3 of his sons in Gaza. So he had all 3 of these pieces, which was still angry at the government, seeing himself as responsible, almost in lieu of the government, to create the support system, and also worrying about his kids' safety and their possibility of returning. So Israelis have become implicated in a really different way, and as a result, and I think this is really important, Israeli anger against the government is not manifesting there in the same ways that our community is divided about the war. What I mean by that is, for instance, many Israelis are strongly advocating for the government to do whatever it needs to do to get the hostages home. But many of those same Israelis are stopping short of using terminology like demanding a ceasefire, because they're not arguing about whether or not the war is legitimate. It's not really an argument within Israeli society. It's a very, very small voice of people who are really anti-war. The majority of Israelis feel the war is perfectly legitimate, the war is winnable, but we also want to advocate for our hostages. And just as one example to this effect, on this past Saturday night in Jerusalem, there were 2 protests. There was one very small anti-war protest, anti-government, anti-war, and one much larger bring the hostages home protest. And that bigger one made sure not to join together with the anti-war one. So they're holding to a position of broadly supportive of the war and at the same time wanting to advocate for their friends and families to be brought home from Gaza, even if that would produce a temporary or short-term pause in the war effort.
Thank you. This is going to be a little bit of a difficult question I'm about to ask. It might hit people a little bit on the emotional level when they hear it. Golda Meir was quoted as saying, "There will be peace once the Arabs love their children more than they hate us." There are some who would argue that Israel now has the challenge to love their children more than they hate the Palestinians. Is this a fair question?
You know, I grew up hearing that phrase also, right? That they obviously want to kill us more than they want safety and security and peace for their children. And then when I was a young adult, I noticed that the same meme appeared in pro-Palestinian groups. Israelis want to kill us more than they want to keep their own children alive. I started noticing that in pro-Palestinian camps, they were using the same. There's another meme like this that says, if Israel put down its weapons, it would be destroyed, right? But if the Palestinians put down their weapons, there would be peace. That's a different version of this story. And I've seen that in reverse in pro-Palestinian camps. And I guess the best and most banal expression of this is both pro-Israel folks and pro-Palestine folks believe that the New York Times is hopelessly biased against their side. In other words, we have these narratives about Israelis and Palestinians that make it as though this conflict is in some ways completely intractable unless the other side totally changes their ways. Now, it might be true. There are certainly a lot of Jews, a lot of pro-Israel folks, a lot of Israelis after October 7th who believe less in the possibility of peace. I'm deeply worried about that. It's very possible that it also is a conversation that a lot of people would say, I'm not changing my mind yet, I just don't want to talk about it right now. My job right now is to focus on solidarity with my people and unity and advocacy for the hostages, and I understand all of that. But I'll give you my really honest answer. There are, 11 million people who live between the river and the sea. What everybody deeply in their heart knows is that the only long-term way for those 11 million people to live in peace and security with a sense of justice is that both of the groups that live in that place, Jews who are part of the state of Israel and Palestinians, whether they are citizens of Israel or Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza, it's going to have to work for everybody. And the thing is everybody kind of knows that. So you have a weird situation where for decades, the majority of Israelis and the majority of Palestinians will say something like, of course we know that we need a two-state solution, we just don't think it's viable. So now we can be very pessimistic about that, or you can acknowledge that that means that the majorities of the people know that they're going to have to eventually find ways to set aside now almost a centuries-old grievances and immense fears that we have towards one another to create the possibilities, whether it's call it baby steps or big risks, to bring about a new reality. I don't think we gain much as a community by parroting Golda Meir anymore. I just don't think we gain a lot out of it. If we do it to acknowledge, to be self-reflective, our community doesn't really believe that we have a partner on the other end, or if we're even more honest, which is we are scared, that's useful, because then you're doing deep examination of what are the obstacles that we have in front of us that would make us want to take risks to produce a different reality. In that context, maybe it's useful. But to actually use it as a way of trying to imagine a future, all it does is close us off from the possibility of something that we know is the only possible solution to this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians.
Thank you. As you were saying, in Israel, there's more of a unified view that this war is justified and needed. In the American Jewish community, it's been a lot harder. I was listening to the podcast of Ezra Klein, and he articulated clearly that the American Jews have 3 distinct generations regarding our relationship with Israel. The first are those who remember Israel in 1967 and 1973 as a small and somewhat fragile country defending itself from its Arab neighbors' goal of destroying the Jewish state, when Israel needed support to survive. The second generation came of age in the 1990s with a strong Israel who was committed to a two-state solution, remembering the Oslo Accords and the famous handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat with Bill Clinton. And lastly, the post-2000 generation who has only seen an Israel that is both strong and not engaged in a long-term peace solution, where the Palestinian question remains unsettled and the government coalitions have been right-leaning and supported the expansions of settlements in the West Bank. Yep. He argues that is why millennials and Generation Z are hypercritical of Israel as a Jewish nation. What do you think the American Jewish community, especially establishment, large institutions and congregations and organizations, need to better understand in order to not lose a generation of Jewish supporters for Israel?
Great. So I think it is a decent characterization, even if a little bit of a caricature, of Jewish life. One of the ways we've talked about this for a long time at Hartman is by referring to that, let's call it that Jews who came of age in 67, and I think the outer limit of that is 76, the last great moment of when Jews around the world felt universally proud of the achievements of the State of Israel on a global stage was Entebbe, the rescue of Entebbe on July 4th, 1976. We've tended to refer to that audience as what we call the troubled committed, folks who have a commitment to Zionism and Jewish life that is probably not going to be ruptured by anything, but it doesn't mean that they're not asking hard questions, that they don't feel troubled either by the problem of occupation or the problem of democracy. And sometimes those are the same problem, but they're not always, because democracy issues include religious pluralism and whether liberal Jews feel comfortable articulating their Jewishness in Israel. So there's a body of questions around both occupation and democracy that troubles the troubled committed. And we also have noticed that the accident of birth has a huge impact on whether you kind of give the State of Israel the benefit of the doubt. So if you happen to have been born, as you said, after those periods of time, your experience of Israel is much less the David and Goliath story of an older generation of Jews. Memories of the Holocaust fade over time, and they become actually quite different. One generation actually might say the key memories of the Holocaust now are not don't be a victim, but don't be a perpetrator or don't be a bystander, which are also plausible lessons from the Shoah. So there's no question that that generational shift has taken place. What's not clear to me is what's happening right now with quote-unquote young people. I'm kind of tempted to just ask them because they're in the back. And I want to notice that they're here. They're in a synagogue on a weeknight, maybe possibly against their will. But hopefully having a good time anyway. It's no part of what's confusing is that there seems to be a powerful media commodified story in the media that the big change is that young Jews, especially after October 7th, are broadly turning away from Jewish peoplehood and from the State of Israel. I don't actually think that's true. I actually think October 7th is having a different effect, which is it's the 67 or 73 moment for young Jews between the ages of 15 and 25, and some small percentage of them are going to come away from a moment like this saying, Israel is the aggressor, Israel is the perpetrator, and I want to make my Jewish identity centered around anti-Israel activism. There's some percentage of that. But I have the feeling that the vast majority of American Jews, young people too, are going to continue the basic patterns that American Jewish identity has exhibited until now, which is I broadly am on the side of the State of Israel, and I have questions about its governance, its politics, and its decision-making. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There was one night, maybe October 16th, where the AP made a big deal of the fact that 500 young Jews had gathered in the Capitol as part of Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, to call for a ceasefire. Unreported that same evening was that there was a gathering in New York of 10,000 Jews outside of the UN, which included several thousand Jewish high school students from around the New York area. So you had quadruple the number of people at a pro-Israel gathering as an anti-Israel gathering, but it didn't get covered. And part of that is, I think, this is a cool story. It's fascinating to watch a dissident community within the Jewish community get amplified, and then you can say, look how fascinating it is that this generation is taking on their parents and grandparents. And I'll give you one other. I was speaking to a reporter for a national publication who was trying to understand how is the majority of American Jewry, which identifies in one way or another as liberal Zionist, how are they processing October 7th? And I sat with this reporter for 2 hours. And at the end of the interview, she said, this is super interesting, it is nuanced, it's complicated, but I probably will not be allowed to write the story because the only articles that my editors want to publish are about the far left. So something strange is going on where it is, on one hand, an interesting story. There are growing ways in which the far left in the Jewish community is consolidating. but it's not on a population level representative of the majority of American Jews. And I just want us to be cautious about not using an interesting story as an automatic predictor of where the Jewish people are actually headed.
So I really respect your viewpoint, and I think from a demographical macro level, I agree with you. But I think the Jewish community is not monolithic.
No, of course not.
And especially as a Reform rabbi, working with students who have multiple identities, and where Judaism isn't always the main identity, I don't think it's October the 7th that's the issue. I think it's how some people felt when there was a government in America when you didn't agree with it and you felt powerless, but now that's compounded by their whole life experience. So if they're 18 years old, for 18 years they've only seen a right-wing government that doesn't represent their view of a two-state solution. And so I think there's a hopelessness and a feeling that how Israel is acting goes against their Jewish values, and 18-year-olds don't do nuance very well. And they're idealistic, and in the environments they're in, the rationales are used to help them say, well, this is what you believe. If you believe this, you should be on our team. And we haven't done a good enough job educating our kids on the nuance, or it hasn't been interesting when they were 16. And I think if you're conservative, if you're a mainstream conservative or modern Orthodox, there's a lot more traditionally pro-Israel. But I think in Reform, Reconstructionists, and unaffiliated, there's a lot of struggle.
So the place where I really disagree with the characterization is that actually 18-year-olds do nuance extremely well, and they can smell when their educators and their community is not doing nuance because it's nervous about what they're going to believe. Now, here's the hard part. Those of us who feel a sense of commitment to the state of Israel and are anxious about the next generation of Jewish life are going to have to find a way to convey what we care about to the next generation without the benefit of them being born at the same time that we were. One generation or two generations of Jews has tried to convey their memories and the accident of birth to the next generation, hoping and expecting that the same commitments are going to endure in that second generation, and has been basically unwilling to talk openly and honestly about how, yes, I care about the state of Israel, and yes, I think that the things that it is doing are wrong. And here's why, but here's why that doesn't necessarily mean that I check out of this story. The truth is, the young people I know, whether through our teen program, we have 190 teens studying with us right now, whether it's college students who come study with us over winter break, whether it's our gap year program where we have Americans and Israelis together, they are desperate for nuance and for being in relationship. They want to solve what feels like oftentimes, and many of us experience, a kind of cognitive dissonance. My parents raised me on Jewish values of justice and righteousness. That's what we're supposed to be about. The state of Israel does things that do not seem just and do not seem righteous. They sometimes feel excluded religiously from the story of what the state of Israel is. On a basic level, young people in America tend to be more left than their parents. Young people in Israel tend to be more right than their parents. So in a world in which political identity and polarization is so profound, it's no surprise that people are like, well, why do I want to be connected to basically a quote-unquote Republican country? Now, that's not the fault of our young people. That's our fault as educational institutions for expecting that people who come after us are going to adhere to the same commitments and beliefs that we had just because of when we happen to have been born. We have to be prepared, rabbis and educators and parents, to talk about the complexity of what Israel represents and to talk about why we adhere to it, why we commit to it. Your analogy to America is very telling. It's true. When Americans live through a period of time when they lose on the side of the presidential election, they don't check out, they get busy, they work harder. That's what patriotism and loyalty demands. You stay connected. So our job as educators, as leaders, is to listen to the nuanced questions that our children and our grandchildren are asking and not be intimidated by them, to not assume that when someone is asking a question, they are automatically the wicked child at the Passover Seder, right? When they're asking questions, We actually view those as indicators that they want to understand why this is important to us without the shortcuts that are necessarily at our disposal. I think it is one of the biggest projects of our work. I think it's the biggest project of our lifetime. If we want Judaism to be essential to the Judaism of the next generation of Jews, we have a huge amount of interpretive and educational work in front of us that we need to start doing.
Connected with that, I've found that being a congregational rabbi at this time has been very difficult because there's such intense emotions, and it's a full array of spectrum from anywhere to the far right to the far left. And however a community leader within the Jewish community represents, there's always a group that's really unhappy with it. And I was talking to a coach who said that that's not unique to my experience here, but this is going on throughout the nation. Do you think for some synagogues or in maybe large metropolitan areas that the Israel question can split congregations and will shape the future of Jewish life in North America?
Yeah, I mean, it's called the death by the Israel sermon. It's a real thing. And one of the consequences that it's created is it is driving professionals out of the jobs. And the thing that it's most likely to produce is that if a rabbi fears that by speaking about the state of Israel, they're going to get somebody angry, the most likely thing that they're going to do is not speak about the state of Israel. And the long-term consequences of that are kind of cleaving between what is Judaism and what is the state of Israel. And this is the larger challenge that we have as a community. This is what I mean by the interpretive challenge. When Israel is thought of as this like weird thing that's like 7,000 miles away and it's in a different language and it doesn't really relate to the Jewish values that I care about, we are signaling we don't know what to do with it. And Judaism, if I talk about Judaism, everybody's happy because that's like warm and fuzzy, and I'm obviously only going to talk about the good Judaism things. I'm not going to talk about the bad Judaism things, and I'm not going to talk about the irrelevant Judaism things, which is basically where we are now in the Torah, right? We're in the irrelevant section for a long period of time. So we don't want to do that. So we allow for these two discourses to be totally different. So the work is, how do I connect the dots between Israel and Judaism? Now, there are easy ways to do that. I'm not saying that the work is easy, but in theory, does Judaism have what to say about power and vulnerability? Yes. Does Judaism have what to say about what it means for the Jewish people to build a society? Yes. Does Judaism have something to say about the relationship between the Jewish people and the family of nations, which is something we're struggling with right now? Yes. These are all profound Jewish topics. We have to figure out a way to talk about Israel in synagogue and elsewhere in a way that centers Judaism and Jewish values. The reason why rabbis get run out of town on the Israel sermon is because when many rabbis start doing the Israel sermon, they become pundits. Nobody really wants, you're probably great, we just met, but nobody really wants your opinion on centrifuges. Nobody trusts them, and you didn't learn about them in rabbinical school, and I'm glad. There shouldn't be. Rabbi Phil Grobart wrote about this years ago. He said, I don't know where somebody expected that in rabbinical school I was supposed to spend a semester learning about Iranian centrifuges. They expect me to know about that and speak about it. Nobody wants it. They want you to hold them, to give them a Torah that appeals and connects to the issues that they care about. So the first challenge is, how do we make sure that when we're engaging on Israel, we're engaging through the stuff that people come to synagogues to deal with? The second challenge we have is bigger than all of us, which is that we are experiencing immense process of political polarization that's not about the Jews. It's just about Americans more generally. Political polarization is pulling this country apart. One example to this, you may not feel it right now, but you will notice it within a decade. Americans are relocating geographically to live closer to people that they vote with. This is being statistically documented. The result is there are fewer and fewer environments where you are likely to come across genuinely bipartisan atmospheres. It's going to happen to synagogues if it hasn't already. In places where there are multiple synagogue options, people are choosing with their feet based on the politics of the congregation and the rabbi. So good news, bad news. The good news is you're only likely to piss off your congregants in one direction because they're moving to one direction. The bad news is that this is centering politics as the primary concern in our communities in ways that makes our job as spiritual leaders a little bit harder. If that's what people mostly care about. And think about it, like a community's values can be discerned from its controversies. Show me what a community fights about, and I'll tell you what it cares about. I wish that Jews in America were fighting about God, or halakha, or the observance of Shabbat. The things we fight about are actually politics. So it means that our stakeholders are coming into shul, they're saying, this is important to me, it's at the center of my Judaism, and my challenge, your challenge as a rabbi, as a spiritual leader, is how do I engage with that thing that they care about, but do so in a slightly countercultural way that people can feel they've learned something, they've been enriched, and they haven't simply been triggered based on the politics from the pulpit.
So I was blessed that for a few years I stepped off the pulpit, and it gave me a new perspective to hear other people be talking heads. So I grew up in Minneapolis area, so I believe that synagogue should be your second home. And so I try to do what you talked about. But humbly, there's a part of me that learned that there was a segment of my congregation that wanted advocacy. So no matter how much hand-holding, education, people wanted to see, not to say anger, but justice and a voice. And so I had to learn how to do that without alienating people, because it's a very fine line. So it's been a really interesting experience for me, but I've been blessed that it's a very supportive congregation and community. With that, as I've been thinking, America is one of the few real allies of Israel. And what's been a blessing over the last few generations is that it's been bipartisan. That people who are Trump supporters view that Trump has done amazing things for Israel by moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and those who are Biden supporters feel that Biden's done amazing things by supporting Israel even when it was unpopular. And for the most part, both political parties have been supportive of Israel. What I've been really blessed with here in New Rochelle is our community works really hard to talk neighbor to neighbor and to work outside the Jewish community, be it clergy of other faith, be it local officials, things of that nature. But for me, I think one of the things that if we really want to help Israel in America, we need to leave our little bubble, and we need to really relate to other people and not just talk at them, but hear what their concerns are and help them build a relationship with Israel. What do you think is possible? Do you think this coalition that we currently have, where the majority of Americans are supportive of Israel, is strong, or is it weak, and that as soon as the winds blow, we're going to feel alone again?
Okay, I'm going to take a few different parts here. So first of all, right now, I don't think it's actually true that Israel has few allies around the world. I think the surprising story, which again you wouldn't discern inside the bubble of ceasefire, not ceasefire, is how steadfast not only America has been in support of Israel fighting this war, but a huge number of Western allies as well. Most of Europe is basically supportive of Israel, and quite amazingly, much of the Middle East is supportive of Israel right now, even though there's a dance between what they can say publicly and privately. So, for instance, it's very clear that the Biden administration is basically giving the Israelis a free hand and quietly whispering to them and saying, we want you to do this or that a little bit different, which is actually the way that you want your allies to do things. It's also very clear that Egypt and the UAE are publicly calling on Israel to go to ceasefire and privately telling Israel to continue. So Israel actually has a surprising amount of international support. What's interesting about that is that one of the theories that have been operative for a number of years is that the reason why America is overwhelmingly pro-Israel, which has not been the Jewish community for a long time, is because of evangelicals. That was very clearly the case during the Trump administration. So you might have expected that under a Biden administration, you would have seen greater distance between Israel and America, and you didn't. So it turns out that Israel actually holds a very significant role as a foreign policy ally of America and as a kind of spiritual ally of Americans in far deeper ways than I think we fully understood beforehand. Every single opinion poll of Americans indicates overwhelming support for Israel in fighting the war against Hamas. And it's obviously a little bit different, Republican and Democrat, but it's majorities on both ends. The bipartisan story, I think, it obviously looks like it's eroding, partly because you have a minority in the Democratic Party that is very, very vocal. That minority is being aided by that political polarization story because of all of the gerrymandering and redistricting. The more a district is 75 to 80% of one political party, the more it's going to incentivize more radical political voices emerging. When you have purple districts, it disincentivizes radical voices, obviously, because they have to win a majority. So yes, you are seeing the emergence of those voices, but every time somebody says to me, America's bipartisan consensus around Israel is disappearing, I'll say, well, tell me what was the last time they had an Iron Dome vote? What was the tally? Do you know what the tally was at the last Iron Dome vote? It was 421 in favor and 9 against. So the story of the diminishment of the bipartisan consensus is, I think, is dramatically overwrought. I don't think it's really true. I think people are scared it's going to happen because they watch what happened with Jeremy Corbyn in England. They see how polarization can take an issue and make it divisive, but it simply hasn't happened yet in America. In fact, the divisions about Israel within the Jewish community are more profound than the divisions about Israel more generally within the United States of America. That doesn't mean that the pro-Palestinian community is those within the pro-Palestinian community who are single-issue voters on Palestine aren't really upset at Joe Biden, the same way that if the deck was reversed, those in the Jewish community who were single-issue voters on Israel would abandon their party and vote for whoever they wanted to support. That's the big political story. But I want us to spend a few minutes locally, because I was here in Westchester, I want to say it was in January or so, maybe December, with a group of executives from the Jewish community from around the Westchester area. They were executive directors of synagogues, JCCs, et cetera. We spent a morning learning together. And the issue we talked about, which was on many of their minds, was a sense that they were abandoned by their allies. This is the kind of coalition problem in the Jewish community. I'm going to say it this way, and you're going to hear why this is problematic. Why didn't my peers pay me a Shiva call? I say that because I want to poke a little bit. It's never good if you're sitting Shiva and keeping a mental spreadsheet about who's not visiting. It's going to not be great for the feeling of Shiva, right? But a lot of us did that in the month or two after October 7th. I'm the rabbi. I went to their community when this bad thing happened to them. They didn't show up for me. It was especially confusing, I think, for a lot of rabbis and Jewish community leaders, because our allies did show up after Pittsburgh. They knew they were supposed to call after the shooting at Tree of Life, right? But they didn't come after October 7th. And many of us as Jewish leaders were like, wait, that's confusing. What happened in Israel is worse. It's the worst pogrom that's happened to the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Why didn't they come? So you could have two hypotheses. One, very dark, is that they are not our allies. And a lot of people have come to that conclusion really quickly. And I got to tell you, as a result of that, there's a real threat right now to the prospect of the continuation of interfaith work in this country. A lot of Jews are saying, like, well, you didn't show up for me, I don't want to come. There's another hypothesis, which is we've built relationships with our neighbors, with pastors and with priests, with ministers, with imams. But we did so in ways in which, like we do with our children and grandchildren, we assume that they understand our relationship with Israel as endemic to our Judaism in ways that we don't have to talk about it or explain it. I think it's actually very plausible that the reason the minister down the street didn't come to pay a Shiva call is because it didn't dawn on her that your attitudes towards Israel, that you feel about what happened in southern Israel, happened to you. It's very possible they felt like, wait, of course, yeah, oh, whatever, they're Jews, but they're thousands of miles away. We have something very strange as part of our Judaism, which is this thing called Jewish peoplehood, where we're not actually a religion. We're a weird nationality. We're weird because we don't look the same, we don't share racial and ethnic characteristics, we don't speak the same language, we don't live in the same place, we don't believe in the same things, we don't practice the same things. In fact, we hold nothing in common with other Jews, except that we see ourselves as part of this construct of belonging to other Jews. For many of us, I see like your head's nodding, you're like, yeah, Jewish people, that's our thing. To everybody else in the world, it is completely incomprehensible. Because there's no other group that acts that way. There are other nationalities, but they tend to live in one place. There are other faiths, but they hold something in common, like the belief systems. We're trying to do something extremely unusual as Jews in the world, which is to hold on to this idea of Jewish peoplehood, and as a result, sometimes others don't understand us. So if one of the projects is around our children and grandchildren, the other project is if we want to have real allies and partners, we are going to have to center our commitments to Zionism, to Jewish peoplehood, as a key piece of how we articulate and explain our identities to others. If we don't do it, we're going to constantly be disappointed that people don't understand us.
Thank you. I want to be respectful to the teens. We teach from 7 to 8 on Tuesday, so they are here of their free will, but I do want to recognize that it is 8 o'clock and it's okay for them to get up and leave if their parents are waiting for them or if they need to go. And with that, we had planned on having an hour conversation and then opening up the floor for questions. So there are microphones on both sides. If people would just line up respectfully and come to the microphones to ask your questions.
Hi.
Hi.
I listen to your podcast all the time, as well as your two colleagues,
Yeah, thank you.
Daniel and Yossi. In December, Daniel was here in America, and he came back and he said on the podcast as he traveled from place to place, this was in December, that American Jews, in addition to talking about October 7th, were talking about what was happening to the Palestinian people in Gaza. And that he, Daniel, then, and Yossi as well, said, we don't hear Israelis talking about the 15,000, 20,000, 30,000 women and children and whatever. And in your talking about your 3 trips, you didn't mention it as well. So I'm interested in, and it's a big discussion here, even among pro-Israel people, the whole question of the humanitarian side of it. So I'm interested in your perspective from what you saw in Israel. And the other question I have briefly, early on you said, you termed the war against Hamas winnable. What does that mean?
Yeah. Okay, so there are 2 main reasons why I think Israelis are not engaging in the same ways that Americans and American Jews are engaging with the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the consequence of the war. One reason, which is very technical, is that the Israeli media broadly is not covering it. So their military censors have a huge effect on what's seen on Israeli television and Israeli radio, and we see much more of the carnage in Gaza than Israelis do, unless they're on Twitter, basically. That's where they can get access to that information. The less technical reason is that Israel is at war with Hamas, and it's a very normal thing in the history of war that civilizations support the side that they're fighting more than they pay attention to the consequences on the other end. Israelis are also unbelievably cynical that what coverage is being played out around the world about what's taking place in Gaza, that like the story is basically rigged against them. Israelis know and believe, and we all kind of know this, that Hamas gets 80% of the aid, seizes the aid when it comes in, and 80% of it goes into the tunnels. So Israelis are in this terrible place of having to effectively adopt a ruthless position around aid because no army in the history of the world feeds the other army that it's fighting against. Why would you do that? In fact, most wars in history were won because the other side was hungry, right? They ran out of supplies and resources. So Israelis aren't seeing that. We are. Now, the reason I didn't speak about it tonight was, number one, when I went to Israel, I didn't go to Gaza. I went to be with Israelis and to listen to their stories. Because some of the Israelis I spoke to were Palestinian Israelis, and they're mad about the war. And I did listen to them and absorb one of my colleagues saying to me with a lot of passion, I was opposed to October 7th, I thought it was terrible, and I'm opposed to the war now. So I had to hear that, and to hear what it means for a Palestinian who is both a citizen of the state of Israel, remember Palestinian citizens of Israel were killed on October 7th, and who also has relatives in Gaza and simply does not want to see the country to which she pays taxes attacking her people. It is a ruthless position that we find ourselves in. I am trying to find a voice, and I want our Jewish community to hold to a voice that doesn't blind ourselves to the suffering of the people in Gaza, that sees itself as supportive of anything that can happen that can create better humanitarian conditions for the people of Gaza. I want to see our community supporting any efforts that can be undertaken to build up the possibility of Palestinian governance, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, creating conditions to a new future and a new reality. But currently, there is a zero-sum game of do you still support the war or not? And I've basically made the choice that from the standpoint of Jewish peoplehood, I've decided to identify with the struggles that Israelis are having in the moment like this, and to not fall into what I feel has become a trap of either being pro-war or anti-war. Because of that, I have people who have said to me, no, it's not pro-war, anti-war. The two positions right now are either pro-ceasefire or pro-genocide. And I refuse to play by that rhetorical game. I think it's a deeply dangerous one. In terms of the winnability of the war, again, I'm not a military expert. There are people who said from day one they believe the war is not winnable because Hamas is an idea, not just an army. I never really believed that argument. All countries and civilizations have ideas, and ultimately, if you can crush their military wing, you can override those ideas over time. I just don't feel that I have access to sufficient information to know whether Israel's actually winning the war. Overwhelmingly, Israelis don't feel like they have that information. This is something that we know from human history is called the fog of war. The information is unavailable to most of us. None of us know, for instance, what percentage of the approximately 30,000 people dead in Gaza are Hamas affiliates. Nobody knows. So absent that, it's really hard to be a kind of predictor and prognosticator of, is the war won, almost won, or even winnable? Let me turn to the side.
Yes, please. I have a lot to say, but let me just make it a quick question if I can. It seems your analysis, which is very stimulating and provocative, seems to leave out what to me is the big news about this event. If you look at college campuses and the Hudson River crossings, the tunnel the other day, seems to be the wholesale desertion of Israel by liberal intelligentsia, what has been traditionally called liberal left-wing liberal intelligentsia, best exampled on college campuses. I also think you have not addressed that. To me, that is the big news to me in America. I can't speak for Israel, I haven't been there lately. But I can tell you this to me is the most shocking, where universities used to have liberal discourse. Now it's Cooper Union time. You take your life in your hands if you identify. You have to lock the doors. Secondly, I would just say it's the excuse of the failure of youth.
So I'm gonna leave it to questions, please.
Okay, then how do you react to the failure to study history, the unique experience of the Holocaust? I don't think it can be compared to Armenia. I don't think it can be to excesses on the Gaza Strip, and I have no doubt there are excesses. I don't see how I can excuse it, and I don't know how with your intelligence and study and sensitivity can excuse the wholesale desertion of Jewish history and even American history.
Thank you. The issue of anti-Semitism, particularly on the left and on college campuses, is a hugely important issue. We could spend the whole time talking about it. The last couple of months, I've been thinking about how to connect the dots between these two stories, between the seismic event of October 7th and its aftermath, and what has felt like an equally seismic event here. And one read is to say there's a kind of cause and effect. This is an immediate response to what's taking place. I actually don't think that's right. Increasingly, there are so many dimensions and dynamics of what's taking place around anti-Semitism here that I think it's more accurate to say the American experience is having its own seismic, almost cataclysmic event that is like faintly related to what took place on October 7th, but actually needs to be understood in its own context. We know this. We have been watching for 20 years now that following the end of the Cold War, the era of a kind of pronounced bipartisan liberalism, which could include conservative liberalism and more progressive liberalism, has been eroding and splitting in two. It goes back to that polarization story before. The dominant ideological position that held sway in this country for the better half of the 20th century, and most importantly, was essential to the thriving of American Jews, was a basic post-Second World War liberal national consensus. We thrived in that story. It was enough pluralism, there was enough, it held political radicalism down on either side. And for the past 10, 15 years, and this is happening around the globe, America's not unique in this respect, we're seeing the rise of global polarization. And whenever there is a period of global polarization, anti-Semitism is one of the indicators. Because when you see political radicalism emerge on the right and the left, they always look to identify scapegoats, or they look for indicators of the kind of social outliers that they can use to blame for their problems. We've seen it happen over the past decade. It happened, what the Trump administration unleashed in this country. I'm not saying that they were not responsible for the rise of anti-Semitism, they were responsible for the normalization of an expression of anti-Semitism on the far right, which got licensed within the administration and where you saw visibly in Charlottesville and in other places. And this is the equivalent alternative version. It's no surprise that it breeds itself on the college campus for a whole variety of reasons, because of the way that college campuses are kind of strange ideological greenhouses. They don't really tell a story of what's fully taking place in a society. If they did, you wouldn't have gone from 1968 and campus riots to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. They're not real predictors, but they sometimes are indicators of the flourishing of really pernicious ideas. And this is the pernicious expression of anti-Semitism in the far left. The problem for us is that we as Jews tend to respond to anti-Semitism by treating the symptoms. The real way that we have to respond to anti-Semitism is by treating the ailment. And the ailment of this country is whether America can go back to its basic liberal democratic sensibility, whether it can make marginal, once again, anti-Semitic ideas on the right and on the left. And that is a huge project that's sitting in front of us. Hi.
It's lovely to meet you. I'm a big fan of the Hartman Institute
Thank you.
and Identity Crisis, and for heaven's sake, and thank you for letting me be here. I wanted to kind of follow up on what you were saying. I'm very Zionist. My children have been to Ramon Nyack for several summers. Yavna, they're big Zionists. However, they're both in public school. And I want to, further what Rabbi Gallup is saying. And, it is a battleground out there. And again, it's not anything that's going on in Gaza. I would never, ever compare it to that. However, I don't want to talk too much, but quick backstory. My niece,
I need you to get the question.
no, but she doesn't call herself a Zionist. She was in and out of bunkers in 2021, okay? She's been there for 2 summers. She refuses to call herself a Zionist. My daughter, who brought in the definition in 10th grade of the UN definition of genocide, went through all of her, friends, point by point, showing them that it's not genocide. We said, we appreciated her strength. We said, Michaela, people disagree. Just agree to disagree, let it go. They didn't let it go. She's not
Yeah.
on their chat anymore, and they're not friends anymore. This is happening.
So what's your question? Or
My question is, I'm sorry. You say to me, oh, the pro-Palestinian rally, the anti-Zionist Jews, and I'm just curious, you're saying there was another rally that was quadruple the size. Tell me, were those kids observant? Were they in day schools? I think there is, within the Jewish community, a huge divide between the day school and the Orthodox Jews and the Reform Jews. And, I consider myself Masorti,
Yep.
whatever, even Masorti, a lot of the rabbinical students there, I work at Ramon Nyack, they're not Zionists, they're anti-Zionists. So there is a,
so I'm
I
gonna
think there
end the
is-
conversation so that
I think
Thank
there.
you,
I
Rabbi.
think there is a real. I think you are right. There is a significant challenge in sectors of non-Orthodox Jewry around this question. I think there are. We could do all of the history of how we've gotten to this point, but most of it, I would attribute to the Orthodox conservative reconstructionist movements have essentially assumed that Zionism as a part of Judaism was intuitive and that it would transmit by osmosis. And it's actually not. David Hartman writes about this in one of his books. He says, Zionism was a revolution of Jewish history. It was Jews basically saying to history, we are tired of waiting for a messianic era. We are tired of thinking about our religion as somehow insulated away from real questions like farming and armies and politics. And we are going to rebel against Jewish tradition by secularizing the story of the Jewish people and taking our own destiny in our hands. So the fact that reform and good law-abiding reform and conservative Jews of the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s went along with that, sent their money and sent their support, mostly that happened because of the profound vulnerability that the Jewish people experienced in the middle of the 20th century. But what we didn't have to do in the 1950s was struggle with the cognitive dissonance between good justice and righteousness suburban Judaism, minorities within a majority culture, pro-assimilation, pro-liberal values, and the fact that the state of Israel was becoming something that was really different from those values. We just kind of hoped it would linger. We sent our kids to Zionist summer camps where sometimes they talked about things like Palestinians and sometimes they didn't, and we just assumed it would carry forth. I can't fix the problem right now for those people today who can't identify with this story. I actually get it. I do think if our community can pay attention to this, we can start saying, what do we need to do that is radically different? That's going to be actually hard for generations of Jews who remember the Shoah. Because if you remember the Shoah, you don't want to give room for somebody to express their doubt of why the Jewish people need a nation state. You take it for granted. You might be even insulted by the question. But you're going to have to put your head in the mindset of someone who looks at this reality and says, this feels totally countercultural to my Judaism. And I feel like that's the educational responsibility of this time. On this, there is absolutely no shortcuts. And I got to tell you, there's no community in the world that likes shortcuts more than the Jewish community. We think, forget about Jewish education, stick my kid on a bus for 9 days in Israel and they're going to be with the Jewish people forever. That is like such a deep way of disrespecting the seriousness of what it means to be a Jew.
So
And we gotta stop
we only
doing
have a time for a couple
Last one?
more.
Yeah. Or a couple more? Yeah.
We'll do 2 more questions. So,
ahead.
So my question is regarding the internal evacuation in Israel, which
Yeah.
surprises me because around the Gaza envelope, they've been dealing with rockets for 15 years. They go in the shelters and they come out and live a normal life. And in the north, where the threat is probably not a land invasion from Hezbollah, but the rockets, which can reach anywhere, and there's nowhere in Israel that's safe from that. What is behind the evacuations, or am I just missing it and it's what everybody would do?
Yeah, in the South, it's a purely factual question. In the immediate aftermath of the war, a very large perimeter around the Gaza envelope became a active military zone, partly because, if you remember, after October 7th, Hamas fighters were still in the southern Israel for about a week afterwards. So it was an active military zone. But then the second reason is, you can't know this unless you see it. I went down to Kfar Aza. The towns are uninhabitable. Many of them are uninhabitable and grotesquely uninhabitable. There's graffiti on the walls outside of the houses indicating whether bodies were found inside. So it's simply, in the southern part of Israel, people cannot go back until the government makes the decision that people will go back. They started to do so this past week. The first kibbutz was opened, was announced they could go back today. But it's going to require millions of dollars of investment to, in some cases, destroy the entire kibbutz and rebuild it. The northern issue is, you're right, in theory, the rockets are an omnipresent issue, but they have been so bad over the past few months. 25% of the housing in Metula is uninhabitable. So people have left. One of the real reckonings the society is going to have is why Israel functionally tolerated this for as long as it did. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of rockets over the past 20 years from both the south and the north, and it was viewed as like, well, that's just the cost of living in Sderot. And the people of Sderot have lost their patience with that narrative. A big question remains whether people are going to go back, and there's a real risk if they don't go back, who goes back and turns those into kind of Gaza settlements?
I guess the last
sorry,
question.
go ahead, I'll let you call.
Yeah, apropos of what you mentioned earlier about the Westchester rabbis who were wondering about their friends who didn't come to pay a shiva call. If you were in a mosque in Dearborn, Michigan right now, and an imam asked you, why aren't you coming to our mourning tents, what would you say to them, and what would you say to them about the upcoming election in November?
Yeah. Look, I think there has to be a way for us as Jews and Muslims in America to be able to answer that question. There has to be a way. My colleagues and I at Hartman, for over a decade, really tried to break new ground in Muslim-Jewish relations by centering Israel and Palestine as part of our identities. Because actually, the reason interfaith relations between Jews and Muslims always break down is because we avoid the elephant in the room. We never talk about it. And then the minute something like this happens, we have no skills, we have no tools to withstand the rupture. I want to be able to show up to that tent. I can also say to you very honestly, I'm not in a place right now where I want to. And I know that's not a great answer. It's an honest answer. Sometimes you're in a place where you're kind of with your people. What I would say to those voters, which they're not going to listen to, is it's going to be worse with the other guy. But to be honest, there's a piece of this that because I know of a Jewish community where there are single issue voters on Israel, I get why someone would say this is the issue that's most important to me. It's surprising that some American Muslims feel that Palestine solidarity is the most important political issue that they're connected to. But I then look at my own community and I'm not that surprised. So, you know what? I can't, in some ways, I can't really be that mad. If somebody says this is the most important issue to me, I hope that President Biden would have, been on the side of, stopping this war. Part of how I take my own pro-Israelness seriously is by respecting.
Wait, hold on.
Is by respecting that someone who holds to a counter position is willing to actually adhere to those values, even at the cost of their own political futures.
And I'll say there's a difference, I think, between our roles as a congregational rabbi versus somebody who's a CEO or a president of an institution. So actually, I reached out to the local Muslim community and I called 4 people. They hung up on me and didn't return my calls. I think the difference is here, most people I talk to are heartbroken for the Palestinians as well. It's not black and white. We feel horrible for all innocent lives that are being destroyed by the terrorist attack on October the 7th, and nobody has a good answer of how to solve it. And we hope that as human beings, we can come together and struggle together and try to find wisdom and faith of making the world a better place. And to me, that's tikkun olam. Not that I have the answer to fix it, but I can sit in the discomfort to hear your view, and we can mourn together and try to, when this is over, try to rebuild together. So that's, to me, my nechemta of this is right now there's not much I can do besides hold your hand, but when it's over, maybe we can rebuild together. So with that, I'm not going to do questions. I would like to end with a prayer that Rabbi John Rosoff wrote that we've been reading on Friday nights that I think is a respectful way to end this really important conversation. Eternal God, receive our prayers for the peace and security of the state of Israel and its people. Spread blessing upon the land and upon all who labor in its interest. Protect Israeli soldiers as they defend our people against missiles, terrorism, war, and hate. Protect the innocent among the Palestinian people, that they may be safe and free from death and injury. Inspire Israel's leaders to both defend our people and follow the ways of righteousness and compassion. Remove from the hearts of our people fear, hatred, malice, strife, and vengeance. May the Jewish people scattered throughout the earth stand strong in solidarity with the state of Israel in times of war and peace. And may they be infused with the ancient hope of Zion. May our people be encouraged by the symbol of Jerusalem as the eternal city of peace. May the state of Israel be a blessing to all its inhabitants and to the Jewish people everywhere. May she be a light to the nations of the world, as together we say, Amen. Thank you for the conversation tonight.